All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange's student webinar series for spring of 2024. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm NAFSE's Science Communications Specialist. And the goal of our student webinar series is to connect students with the fire and forestry community to develop positive working relationships as well as exchanging knowledge. Today, we're super excited to have Kathleen Stutzman from the University of Vermont with us, and she'll be speaking on regeneration dynamics and understory plant community response in Northeast pitch pine barrens under a range of restoration scenarios. Now, before we get started today, just kind of want to mention a couple of things. We're going to go ahead and let Kathleen start her presentation, and we're going to hold off on any questions until the very end. But if you do have some questions along the way, feel free to pop those into the chat. And then again, we'll revisit those at the end of Kathleen's presentation. We'll then go ahead and close the hour with some announcements about our remaining 2 student webinar series that we have coming up. And then any other information about getting involved with the student webinar series. So why don't we go ahead and just take a moment to go ahead and put in our name and our agency in the chats to see who's on today. All right, so we've got Jason, welcome. Amanda, welcome, Amanda. Dana's here, Ryan, Sharon, thank you all for joining us. Got Tom from Mass Wildlife. Got a wide variety of different agencies joining us today. Austin, Paul from Mass DCR, thank you. Okay, so then let's go ahead and we're going to toss it over to Kathleen. And Kathleen, feel free to share with the group a little bit about yourself and past activities, and then feel free to roll right into your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I do have a little bit of a chest cold, so we might have to hold for some coughing, but hopefully not. So I'll be talking with you today sort of about how different silvicultural treatments impact regeneration and understory plant communities. But before I get into that, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So I have a Bachelor's of Science in Forestry from the University of Vermont. I've done some seasonal work installing long-term forest monitoring plots for SUNY ESF and the National Park Service through the Northeast Temperate Monitoring Network. I also worked as an assistant forester for New England Forestry Consultants down in southern Vermont. I'm a licensed forester here in the state of Vermont, and I'm also a technical service provider for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And for about 8 years, I worked as a conservation forester for Family Forest, which is a nonprofit located in Center West Vermont. And there I wrote a lot of forest management plans for use value appraisal, which is the statewide tax abatement program. I also created and led timber sales. I designed new and improved existing forest access networks, and I developed a lot of grant projects with private landowners through NRCS and helped them follow those through. And then Vermont Family Forest has a long-term sort of monitoring project called the Colby Hill Ecological Project, where they've got about 20 years of data on small mammals and reptiles and amphibians and birds. And so I developed and added to that some long-term forest monitoring plots. And I also did a lot of educational outreach with local college classes and high school students, mainly about community and family forestry. About myself in my spare time, I really love to go hiking and backpacking. I'm an Adirondack 46er. I am a corridor mountain monitor for the Green Mountain Club, which means that I paint boundaries in really dense spruce fir forests. I also volunteer with the Birds of Vermont Museum here in my community, and lead tree identification for birders walks, as well as just sort of participating in everything that they do. And I've been really enjoying learning so much more about birds. I generally go on a yearly backpacking trip. The photo here is Teton, and I am very into plants. And so the photo on the right is from a time that I discovered a new subpopulation of Appalachian Jacob's Ladder in the up in the Green Mountains here, which I was looking it up for this presentation. I guess it's called Bog Jacob's Ladder now, but I was able to go out with the Native Plant Trust, some volunteers from them, and sort of document that new population. So that was very fun. And I've got an 11-year-old tan dog named Cal, and just last week I got a 12-week-old puppy, which has been pretty crazy. So moving back into my research, I know probably a lot of people here today are very familiar with pitch pine barrens, but sort of just to get us all on the same page, I'm just going to give kind of some good grounding information. So pitch pine barrens are a globally rare endemic natural community type. They're found mainly from present-day New Jersey to Maine. You can see this lovely map that UMass put together. And so this shows sort of two types of pitch pine communities in the Northeast. There are Rocky Ridge sort of outcrop communities, and then there are these pitch pine barrens, which are located on deep sandy glacial outwash. And so for my study, I'm just looking at those barren communities and not those Rocky Ridge communities. So pitch pine barrens are home to multiple rare, threatened, and endangered species sort of across the Northeast. And again, speaking about those soils, those underlying soils, these pitch pine barrens come in two types, which are sort of coastal barrens, generally found on the terminal moraines of glaciers like Long Island or Cape Cod. And then there are inland barrens, which are located on like glacial lakes, like the Albany Pine Barren. And so pitch pine barrens are a fire-dependent community type, and they're composed of fire-adapted species, namely pitch pine, shrub and tree oaks, and ericaceous shrubs. And as you may be well aware, here in the Northeast, dry lightning strikes are really quite rare, which leads me to my next slide. The research undertaken in my study takes place on the lands of multiple tribal nations, including the Shinnecock, Umpqua-Jogs, Setauket, Stockbridge, Munsee community, Mashpee Wampanoag, Wampanoag of Gayhead Aquina, Nausuet, Pokanoket, and Pequawket nations, and the Haudenosaunee and Wabanaki confederacies. Pitch pine barrens have important historic, current, and cultural value, and the relationships tribal nations had and continue to have with pitch pine barrens are essential to their character and restoration. Furthermore, my research is undertaken at the University of Vermont, which resides on the traditional, ancestral, and current lands of the Abenaki Nation. The colonization of these lands is an ongoing process, and as a settler, I'm the beneficiary of the colonization and study of Indigenous homelands. In my research, I have the responsibility to advocate for the sovereignty of tribal nations and the return of land and financial resources to Indigenous people. So colonization had pretty profound effects on pitch pine barrens through the forced removal and genocide of tribal nations. Colonization both increased and decreased fire in spatial and temporal scales, and the land clearing for agriculture and subsequent abandonment had pretty profound impacts on community structure and composition. On top of that, government policies were used to control fire or to prevent its use as a management tool. Again, the soils here are, highly developable. Think of Cape Cod or Long Island. And so there are some pretty profound issues with fragmentation and complications with management along the wildland-urban interface. So on top of all these things that have kind of been going on in the past, we now have novel threats from climate change. And mainly what I'm talking about here is the recent range expansion of southern pine beetle. So southern pine beetle, if you're not familiar, is a native beetle. It's long been a player in hard pine systems in the southeast. But with warming winters, it's sort of started to migrate its outbreak range north. And so it's a bark-boring beetle. It releases pheromones, which allows for aggregation and creates these outbreak conditions, which can really rapidly cause overstory mortality and spread across the landscape. And management strategies in the Southeast has mainly focused on sort of lowering basal area and increasing intertree distance to increase tree vigor and kind of alter stand microclimate to prevent that aggregation, that pheromone release. And so the issue with pitch pine barrens here in the Northeast is that those that haven't been actively managed have significantly densified, and they have a lot of overstory trees of low vigor, which make them ideal outbreak sites for southern pine beetle, as we will see.
Excuse me, Kathleen. Uh,
Yes.
so sometimes there's a delay in the moving of the slides, but then also I think my connection isn't too good, so sometimes you're a little scratchy. Let's go ahead, if you don't mind, you can continue, but go ahead and stop your video, and we'll see if
Okay.
that improves it, and then I'll have you kind of come back on at the end. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I do live in a very rural area, so I don't have the best internet connection. So thank you all for your patience. So here we are at one of my research sites. This is Wortham National Wildlife Refuge down in Long Island. And outlined here in white is the black Tupelo unit. This is March of 2012, and we can see sort of that dense conifer overstory here in this winter photo. And those are primarily all pitch pine. Moving on to September of 2013, we start to see these brown spots appearing. And so those are almost certainly sort of the initial outbreak sites of southern pine beetle. Here we are in June of 2014. We see that brown has really spread throughout the stand. And so southern pine beetle isn't officially documented as being present in outbreaks conditions on Long Island until the fall of 2014. And here we are in March of 2015. So this took less than 2 years. And as we can see, there's pretty much complete overstory mortality of pitch pines. And so this represents, first and foremost, a loss of seed source and genetic diversity. But because this site hasn't seen any active management, there are these underlying issues of mesification and densification. So the community, here is not full of pitch pine regeneration, sort of poised to take advantage of the instead it's oaks and maples. And so, it's poised, really, this community is poised to transition into a new stable state from which it will be really difficult to detransition back to that rare community type that we're really interested in keeping around. And so, southern pine beetle was found in outbreak conditions this summer off the coast of Massachusetts, and it's been found in traps as far north as Maine, though certainly not in outbreak conditions, but, this shows us that it is on the move. And so here's the black Tupelo unit today. And it's a pretty stark change. So, hopefully this illustrates kind of the need to understand best management practices to establish and retain pitch pine regeneration, to get ahead of southern pine beetle as it moves through the Northeast, and to make these communities more resilient to climate change. So my study is an observational study, and I started by contacting land managers across the Northeast to see what sort of treatments had taken place, where and when. And so from that, I teased out kind of 5 different areas in which I would do my sampling. So the Albany Pine Bush in Albany, New York, areas both on and off the Cape, but generally in the vicinity of the Cape, in Massachusetts, down on Long Island, up in Ossipee, in the Ossipee area in New Hampshire, and then over in Waterboro in Maine. And from the information that I kindly got from land managers, I was also sort of able to tease out what sort of treatments were happening across the landscape, so that I could replicate them in different regions. And so those 4 treatments are fall prescribed fire, spring prescribed fire, harvesting, which was both commercial and non-commercial, and then mowing followed by prescribed fire. And um, areas generally tended to stay with their seasonality of fire. So if they were already doing spring fires, they were probably doing spring fires and then mowing, and vice versa with fall fires. So I wasn't really able to look at the seasonality of the application of fire with mowing, just because there wasn't enough treatments available. And then I also looked at sort of control sites which hadn't been treated, actively managed in at least 30 years, many of them much, much longer than that. And so, as you can see, those are available in every region. So here is a map of my study sites. And for the study design, I wanted to replicate those treatment types across 3 regions. So when I was looking for spring fire, I wanted to find 3 different regions where I could look and sort of assess the application of spring fire and the response of regeneration. And only 2 treatments were available for harvest. It just wasn't as common. And now in each treatment type and region, I sampled 3 management units that had had that sort of treatment applied to it. So 3 areas spring fire, on Cape Cod. And then for control sites, I only sampled 2 because it was available in every region. And so we also have a pretty good idea of what's happening in control sites. The areas that I sampled were treated between 2015 and 2022. And I did try to sort of cluster temporally when possible, but it certainly was not an experiment. So I didn't get to choose when the units had been treated. And then generally I was looking for management units that had to be at least 1.2 hectares, which is 3 acres, because I buffered the edges by at least 30 meters, preferably 40 meters, in order to control for edge effects. And then really large units were subsampled. And then I did on Cape Cod, I also took a look at sites that had southern pine beetle outbreaks that hadn't been treated. But those, thankfully, I was not able to sort of replicate that condition in any other region yet. So I couldn't really compare those treatments sort of across the Northeast. So moving into my methodology. So at each we took site level data, like looking for serotiny in pitch pine cones. We took plot level data, things like looking at the basal area per hectare. And then I assessed regeneration in 3 different size classes and plot sizes. So firstly, in a 1 meter square frame, I looked for small seedlings, which were less than 50 centimeters tall. In the 10 meter square circular plots, I looked for seedlings that were 50 centimeters tall to less than 2.5 centimeters in DBH. Those are my large seedlings. And then finally, in the 25 square meter circular plots, I looked for saplings. So at least 2.5 centimeters, but less than 10 centimeters in DBH. And so that information was taken at every plot point, and then every other was sampled more intensively. in the 1 meter square frame, also took information about vegetative diversity and abundance using percent cover with 8% cover classes. And I took information on sort of ground cover classes using that same percent abundance. So that's, what's the percent cover of moss or rock or exposed mineral soil. And then finally I took two samples of leaf litter depth. And now pitch pine regeneration really prefers exposed mineral soil. So we want to kind of capture that relationship with leaf litter and exposed mineral soil by taking a look at leaf litter depth in these treatment locations. So moving on to some preliminary results for pitch pine regeneration. These are all generalized linear mixed models. And so this first one that we're looking at here is looking at that small seedling abundance, so those less than centimeters in height. And in the modeling, sort of three factors came out as being important. First was the average understory vegetative cover. Second, the average leaf litter depth. And thirdly, the shrub oak seedling counts. And so as all of these increased, so did the predicted counts of pitch pines fall. And so for average understory vegetative cover and shrub oak seedlings, this could be kind of a direct competition for water and light. And it could also speak to sort of the evenness in the application of the treatment. So, areas that weren't treated as intensively may not have removed sort of competing vegetative cover. And then for average leaf litter depth, again, as it increases, so do those counts of pitch pine small seedlings fall. And so, that really speaks to that relationship with, removing leaf litter being a more conducive environment for pitch pine germination. All of these counts have been log transformed to more easily compare to each other, but just to give you sort of the real world numbers for average understory vegetative cover, it's from about 5 to 200%. For average leaf litter depth, about 0 to 13 centimeters. And then those shrub oak seedlings from about 0 to 40. And just to sort of talk about what's going on in the x-axis here, my sites, they didn't all have the same amount of time between when they were treated and when they were sampled. And so time is used as an offset in this model to account for that. And so really we're looking at sort of counts over time or rate. So that's just sort of what that means there. And so all of these treatment types were significantly different from control, which we can see in yellow kind of flatlining across the bottom there. And that's because there's just not a lot of regeneration happening in these control sites. But none of them were significantly different from each other. However, like the fall prescribed fire, spring prescribed fire, and harvesting, also good signs of success in terms of creating small seedling regeneration. Now moving on to factors that affect large seedling abundance. Here again, average leaf litter depth comes out as being really important. And as you may have guessed, harvest is the only treatment type that's significantly different from control. And so this, I think, speaks to, I had several sites on Cape Cod that had really great mineral scarification and really great large seedling pitch pine regeneration. And so we can kind of see that coming through here in the model. And then finally, looking at sapling abundance. And so here we see three factors, again, coming through as being important. The first one is the average average basal area per hectare. As that increases, so do counts of pitch pine saplings. And that's especially true for harvest and mowing sites. And so again, that may speak to kind of a patchiness in the application of treatment, right? In areas that weren't harvested as intensively, excuse me, it's probably more likely that, saplings survived. Sorry, I just had to cough there for a second. And again, for the second factor, we see that average leaf litter depth again coming through. So as that increases, so do those counts fall. And then finally, we see that counts of other saplings. So as those increase, as those increase, so do the counts of pitch pine saplings fall. And these effects were these variables were kind of taken at different scales. Some of them in a 1 square meter plot, some of them per hectare. So they've been standardized and more readily compared to each other. So just to give you kind of their real world figures, average basal area per hectare generally ranges from about 0 to 45 square meters, and then counts of other saplings from about 0 to 9. And so here, no treatment types were significantly different from each other. And, also just to note that I collected data from sites that had been treated. The furthest sort of back we're looking is 7 years, some of them much more recently. And so it's unlikely that the saplings in these areas were created from that most recent treatment. And so it's much more likely that they sort of were the result of an earlier disturbance and sort of survived the most recent treatment. So some sort of takeaways from pitch pine, for pitch pine regeneration, right? There's no silver bullet. There's no one treatment that, stood head and shoulders above the rest. But we do see treatments that are more effective at reducing leaf litter depth have more pitch pine regeneration across size classes of regeneration. And so fall fire, spring fire, and harvest treatments, they all show signs of success, and they all sort of have varying abilities to remove leaf litter depth through scarification, through smoldering, things like that. And then especially for understory, for small seedlings, the reduction in sort of understory vegetative presence is really important. And so I also did some modeling with shrub oak. And so for shrub oak, what I'm talking about are scrub oak and then dwarf chinkapin. So they're oaks that have that kind of clonal growth form and they never really become a tree. And of course, they can be really important sort of habitat and food sources for especially rare Lepidoptera. So that's another thing managers might be thinking about managing for in the work that they do. Of course, it's a bit easier to get shrub oak to sort of sprout back than perhaps to get pitch pine regeneration in place. But in my modeling, I found that sort of treatments with fire were really significantly different from control treatments. And so they sort of show success that fall fire, spring fire, and here fire followed by prescribed mowing followed by prescribed fire, they all show signs of success for establishing and maintaining shrub oak, especially through the small seedling and large seedling classes. In addition to that regeneration treatment, I was also very interested in how silvicultural treatments may impact understory plant communities, right? Because these provide food and cultural values and important habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species. So I thought it would be really interesting to see whether or not different treatments can create or move along sort of different understory diversity and abundance. And I also really like to identify understory plants. So I got to do that as well. So what I did first was sort of just to take a look at some kind of common diversity metrics. And so in the first column, we see kind of the observed species richness, followed by the kind of jackknife estimates in parentheses there. And what that means is just, we can count a certain number of species, we can identify and find a certain number of species, but it's pretty much very unlikely that we would have found all of them. And so that's just why we use the jackknife estimates to get an idea of, how many were we potentially missing. And so you can see that that definitely varies between these different kind of treatment types, of course, with the caveat that the harvest, which is the lowest, also had the least amount of sites sampled. And so in the second column, we're looking at the sort of per point species richness. So at your average point, how many species did you find there? And that's followed by the standard deviation. And so those are quite a bit closer together. In the third column, I'm looking at evenness. So that's sort of like, is the abundance of these species even? And so for me, I'm looking at kind of the percent cover that it takes up in that 1 meter square frame. So if something, in that square frame, if you had two species and one was a trace amount and the other one was 80% cover, that would be pretty uneven, as opposed to if each of those two species covered about 40%. That would be a much more even distribution. So this scales from 0, which is quite uneven, all the way up to 1, which would be very even. And so here we see, most species it's between 0.71 and 0.75. So they are really relatively evenly distributed kind of across treatment types. And then I also looked at kind of the per point diversity using the Shannon index, which kind of both looks at richness and evenness together. And again, those figures are really quite similar as well. So what I wanted to do next was to sort of look at those different sites as different plant communities in relation to each other. And so I chose to use non-metric multidimensional scaling, which sounds very fancy, but is a pretty simple concept. And so it's sort of just to take the average site, like what's the average understory of each site that I looked at? What does that look like? And how similar or different is it to other sites? So it's kind of a measure of distance and areas that are points that are very far away from each other are very dissimilar, and points that are close to each other are much more similar. It's also known as ordination. So I started by taking all of my sites, here 47 sites, and kind of putting them into a first ordination. And so each site here is represented by a dot, and each of the regions are color-coded. And you can see, looking at those purple and blue sites, so that's Massachusetts, or that's Maine and New Hampshire, they're really close to each other. They're really quite similar. And so, I thought of those as kind of northern barrens, right? They're really they're next to each other, basically, sort of on the northern end of what we're looking at here. And then as we look at those, the green and gold, that's Massachusetts and Long Island, right? So those are the coastal barrens. And again, they're really quite close to each other. And then finally, off to the left, at the bottom left here, we've got the Albany pine bush, which I think of as an inland barren. And of course, I only sampled 5 sites, so it would have been great to have another inland barren in there, but I think that's pretty good sort of analysis of what's, going on here. And it does make a lot of sense, right? That, these northern barrens would have a lot more similar species, and so would these coastal barrens, and so would these inland barrens. So it really is quite logical. But in order to take a look at what's going on in these understory communities, I kind of needed to pull out that regionality because it was so strong and so clear. So I decided to look at these communities in 3 different ordinations instead of one, to be able to sort of more tease out the effects of treatment in each kind of regional group. And so I'm only going to show you one of these because they're kind of a lot to look at. So this is the ordination for the coastal barrens. So that's Massachusetts and Long Island. And we can kind of see each point here is a site, and sort of these ellipse kind of, sort of say generally where are these, in red spring fire treatments located, in this ordination space. And so kind of just to read through this, communities, these points that are at the top half of this figure, they have a lot more greenbrier and pitch pine in their understories, and they have more moss cover. Meanwhile, on the ground cover. And, sort of moving to the bottom half of the figure, these sites, they have more cow wheat and wintergreen. And then, sites points on the left hand of the figure, they've got more lowbush blueberry and sheep laurel and dwarf chinkapin oak, as opposed to those on the right, which have more scarlet oak. And so we can kind of see how these different sites have different sort of species in them and abundances of the species. And of course, for the control sites, which are in yellow here, as we move into those control sites, the pitch pine basal area is higher. So that really makes sense. So I used some sort of pairwise analysis to take a look at, are these understories significantly different from each other? And so I found that the mowing units, the mowing followed by prescribed fire, they are significantly different from spring fire and control sites and harvest sites, which does really, kind of make sense when you look at those ellipses. And then the same held true, for harvest units. Harvest understories were significantly different from those of spring fire and control units. And then we did see some species coming through as indicator species for different communities, for different treatment types. So dwarf chinkapin oak, sheep laurel, and raspberry were indicators of mowing followed by prescribed fire units. And then greenbrier was an indicator species of harvest units. And this ordination is actually 3-dimensional. And so I'm just showing you the 2 dimensions that sort of occupy the most variation. But it is kind of a complex ordination. So some kind of takeaways from this work in understory plant communities. Well, first is there's a really strong regional difference. And the impact of treatment varies from region to region. And then control units are often associated with more shade tolerant and mid to late successional species. So in other analysis, Canada Mayflower or Arrowwood viburnum are coming through as indicator species for control, or Easter white pine, and so things that we associate maybe with that mesification and densification. And of course, there's a lot more work for me to do in this space, but it is exciting. So I'm just going to sort of give you a final refresher and overview kind of what I've learned in this work. And so, for pitch pine regeneration, again, there's no silver bullet, but fall prescribed fire, spring prescribed fire, and harvest treatments, they all show signs of success for pitch pine regeneration. And the more a treatment can remove leaf litter and sort of knock back other understory vegetation, the more successful it's likely to be in having that pitch pine regeneration. For shrub oak regeneration, again, those fire treatments, spring fire, fall fire, and mowing followed by prescribed fire, are all, successful in establishing and maintaining shrub oak regeneration. And then finally, as I really just spoke about for understory plant communities, there's a really strong influence, and there's that regional interaction between treatment types and community composition. And so this needs more exploration, but there's definitely a potential that different treatment types could be used to encourage species composition and desired species composition and abundance in barren understories to serve sort of different goals, whether they be ecological or economic or cultural. And so finally, we're putting together a regeneration guide for land managers, which hopefully will be available this fall. But the work isn't over yet, so there are definitely signs that these silviculture treatments can be applied in a nuanced way to support management goals, from pitch pine regeneration to shrub oak regeneration to, sort of the abundance of different understory plants. And it's very exciting. And so I'd like to just give some special thanks to all the many, many land managers who spoke with me and helped me find housing and got me permits and gave me all sorts of data in their time. And my many, many project partners, and of course to my incredible field help, without which I would not have been able to sample 50 sites and over 1,000 subplots and have such a great time despite the many air quality concerns. So thank you for coming to my talk, and I hope you have some questions.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. If you want to go ahead and try turning on your camera, perfect. And then just leave that screen up so people can see. Kathleen's email is there if you have any additional questions. I've got a couple. I also got a message from Amanda Mahaffey, who's going to have to drop off here shortly, but I wanted to start with her question to you. It says, Kathleen, you've had a lot of great forestry experience in cool forest types across New England. You've also seen them in different states of resilience. As you study these pitch pine barrens, how well do you feel they are doing compared to some of the other forest types and systems? How urgently do you feel treatments like thinning and prescribed burning are needed to restore ecosystem functions in pitch pine barrens?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. There's a real range. So I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of pitch pine people, and they're really very passionate. And they're a really great community, so there's a real range. Like when you think about the Albany pine bush, they really started with fire reintroduction in the 90s. And they've been doing it ever since and growing that program. So, there are some sites where they are, I would think, really resilient because there's been a lot of active and hands-on management. And that has really, kept those communities in that open condition where they're sort of more resistant to issues with southern pine beetle. And and then there are areas where there really hasn't been a lot of management, and they're really densified and mesified, and they're really ready for that community transition should an event like southern pine beetle come through. So there's a range in what's happening, and I think a lot of people have responded to southern pine beetle in a meaningful way, especially the state of New York and Long Island. There are many sites there that are highly at risk. So it's certainly important, this is a globally rare endemic natural community type that's really special to our region. And it really does need to sort of see us and feel us and hear us as land managers and as participants in that community in order to be resilient. So I think there's a lot of room to grow that, but certainly some people have been on that journey for a long time and are sort of great examples of how we can do this work.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now, and then we'll share those with Kathleen. One of my questions I think is almost similar to what Amanda had and maybe what you were just talking about. But so based on your research at the 5 different sites, um, is there one site in particular that might be doing better than another with respect to regeneration, or are they all just your observations, the actions that are being taken at those sites all helping with regeneration, or is there one that might be really standing out more than another?
Um, I think by and large across my study, pitch pine regeneration was never common. And so I do think that it's a pretty pressing issue, and I don't think anyone has, really completely kind of hit the right formula. It is still pretty rare. And, when we think about these communities, some of this restoration has been going on for quite a while and has really picked up steam, and some of it is really new within the past, 5 or 10 years. And there's been, thinking about leaf litter, there's been a lot of accumulation of leaf litter over that time, right? So like one treatment isn't really going to solve the problems, right? A lot of this is going to take sort of repeat engagement, repeat management to kind of restore the sort of community structure and function that is really the way that this ecosystem perpetuates itself. Um, so this management over time is really what's going to be the most important. Um, and yeah, I think, it is, I wasn't able in my work to find enough sites that had been sort of summarily treated time and time and again to be able to look at what is the influence of sort of repeat fire or repeat harvesting or whatever it is. Hopefully down the line, someone will be able to. But I do think that that'll be a really important factor in getting good regeneration is having those repeat treatments.
So thanks. And my last question is just pitch pine is still new to me. I got to see the ones in Maine last fall, which was awesome. But what is pitch pine serotiny?
Oh yeah, great. So serotiny is sort of like closed cones. So cones that are closed over a long period of time. And then it usually interplays with pyrascence. So cones that need fire or heat to open. And so pitch pine is a species that can be both serotinous and non-serotinous. So that means it can have these closed cones that sort of hold over time, over decades, waiting for the right opportunity to open, or it could have cones that after, a year and a half, 2 years, they open and just spread their seeds. So sort of throughout its range, there's a variety of serotinous and non-serotinous pitch pine trees. Usually they're separate trees, though like very rarely you can have serotinous and non-serotinous cones on the same tree, which like jack pine, that's very common to have, not very common in pitch pine. So like thinking about like the dwarf pine plains in New Jersey, which really experience very frequent fire, those have a lot of serotinous cones, right? Because it's been selected for over time. Meanwhile, areas that don't see as much fire, it really wouldn't, benefit them to have the serotinous cones over time. And so they would have more cones that sort of open after maturity instead of waiting. And so in my study, I did find that serotiny was present like pretty much across the region. I don't think I saw any in Maine, but I saw serotinous cones in every other site that I looked at, with the caveat that last summer, especially I sampled for 2 summers, last summer especially was very wet. And so I sort of tried to control for making sure that the conditions were dry enough, that the cones weren't just closed because it had been raining, which is something that pines do to kind of protect themselves. Other studies have done, way more intensive sampling where they cut trees down and take a look at cones that way. But I was just using binoculars.
Great, thank you. We got a question from, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name, uh, Shlomaya Lightfoot. She says, looking at the understory community's regeneration in the different geographic areas and different treatments, do you have a sense of where native versus non-native presence and or where medicinal, edible, and non-medicinal, non-edible presence is stronger or weaker?
Okay, yeah, great. This is a great question, something I'm really interested in. So first, just to talk about sort of invasive plants, what was exciting and really surprising in these communities, which had all by and large experienced pretty recent disturbance, was that there was really a very limited number of invasive plants. So I saw Japanese barberry at one site in Maine, and at the rest of these sites, I really didn't see anything except for the Albany pine bush. That was kind of the outlier. The Albany pine bush had quite a few invasive plants. And I think that sort of has more to do with just the amount of roads and fragmentation that's happening in the Albany pine bush and a long history of planting things like uh, um, Japanese or no locust. That's a big problem they have there. But so by and large, there really wasn't a lot of invasive plants, which was really exciting because you do expect them in areas of recent disturbance. So I didn't really see kind of maybe a treatment type being associated with that. And really, it was just really concentrated in the Albany pine bush, sadly. For medicinal and edible plants, that's an area I'd like to explore. I know, there's a lot of blueberries, there's a lot of huckleberries, there's a lot of like American hazelnut and raspberry. And so these communities, are really incredible food sources. And things like sassafras and other plants that have maybe cultural value are also present in them. And so that is an area that I would like to explore more for the ordination. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I wanted to look into that. But at this time, I don't have, a single treatment or a treatment in a region. I don't have that information yet, but I am hoping to sort of get some information there. So thank you.
I hope that answered your question, Shlomaya. Yep, she said thank you. So, okay. Any other questions here before we wrap things up? Okay. Well, you can still have time. I'm going to just mention a couple of quick notes here before we do close this session. So our Spring 2024 student webinar series has two more talks to go. We've got on April 25th, Matt Wozniak from West Virginia University will be speaking. And then on May 2nd, Trevor Roper from Columbia University will be sharing his presentation with us. And so I'll drop that link in here as a reminder. You can learn more about those talks as well as information related to registration for those two. And then I also put in there my email. I'd like to reach out to anybody if you're a student or you know a student that would be interested in maybe sharing their work with us. We would greatly appreciate it. And I've got, again, my contact information, Eric Evanson at nafsehelp@gmail.com. And we'd love to connect with you and make something happen. So just know that those opportunities are there. We're pretty much set for the spring of 2024, but we're already looking out into fall of 2024. So I know, Kathleen, I think you were a situation where you weren't quite done with your stuff. You wanted to present, but once you got closer, so we were able to get you for the spring versus last fall. So, again, reach out to me if you'd like to participate. And so with that, I'm not seeing any more questions. So again, Kathleen, thank you so much. It was very informative. Greatly appreciate your presentation today. And again, people, if you want to reach out to Kathleen, you've got her email there. And we're actually going to stay on the call here for just a couple more minutes. And I'm going to open up everybody's ability to share their screen and also their microphone. And if they'd like to talk or ask any last minute questions, we'll still be around. So again, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you everybody today for taking part in NAFSE's student webinar series for spring of 2024. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.